Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and highly critical breakdown of a day that literally made history. According to our source material, on June 12, 2026, right at the 9:30 a.m. opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, something totally unprecedented happened. The SpaceX IPO launched, and Elon Musk officially became the world's very first trillionaire. Now, our source takes a really deep, critical dive into the exact mechanics of how this went down, pulling back the curtain on the hidden realities behind this absolutely mind-boggling number.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this down systematically. We'll start with the $1 trillion milestone, compare paper wealth versus real cash, look at valuations built on dreams, unpack the buy, borrow, die strategy, examine the role of politics, and wrap up with wealth and real-world impact.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the $1 trillion milestone. So, the source points out a pretty fundamental problem right off the bat, which is that the human brain just isn't wired to comprehend the sheer scale of $1 trillion. I mean, it's a 1 with 12 zeros, right? It's so easy to just gloss over it in conversation. But let's try to put this into perspective. If someone handed you $1 trillion today and you spent $1 million every single day, it would still take you over 2,700 years to run out of cash. Think about that for a second. This single individual's net worth is now larger than the GDP of most countries on the planet.
And this brilliantly illustrates the point using the dimension of time to truly ground the magnitude of this number in reality. If we go back 1 million seconds, well, that takes us back about 11 and a half days. Okay, not too hard to grasp. A billion seconds? That takes you back roughly 32 years. But 1 trillion seconds? You're traveling back 31,000 years. That is literally to an era before human civilization even began. That is the sheer magnitude of the wealth we're analyzing today.
Moving right along to Section 2, paper wealth versus real cash. So you might be wondering, how is this astronomical net worth actually calculated in the first place? Well, it's mostly derived from an estimated 38% stake in SpaceX, which is valued at a massive $2.2 trillion, and a roughly 15 to 25% stake in Tesla, valued at over $1 trillion. But there is a massive catch here. The source highlights a major illusion. This is almost entirely what we call paper wealth. In fact, Musk himself has indicated that only about 0.1% of his wealth is actually liquid cash. The other 99.9% completely tied up in shares. If he actually tried to sell all those shares for cash at once, the market would panic, investors would instantly pull out, and the share price would completely crash. So essentially, we're talking about a number on a screen that's sustained entirely by the collective trust of the market.
Next up, Section 3, valuations built on dreams. Now, the source highlights a pretty glaring contradiction here. How exactly did companies like SpaceX achieve a staggering $2.2 trillion valuation when they actually reported multi-billion-dollar losses in 2025 and 2026? Independent research firms cited by the source actually value SpaceX at closer to $780 billion, which is just a fraction of its market price. To explain this massive gap, the source introduces these two concepts from economist Burton Malkiel. First, you have the firm foundation theory, where value is based on actual solid fundamentals like profit and production. Then, on the other hand, you have the castles in the air theory. This one is driven almost entirely by psychological hype and future dreams. The source argues that this massive trillion-dollar valuation relies heavily on building these castles in the air, basically selling investors on the dream of Mars colonies and space data centers, rather than focusing on current actual profits.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the source argues this heavily relies on a pattern of unfulfilled promises used to maintain that psychological hype. Just look at the timeline. In 2013, we had the Hyperloop, a super-fast transport concept that ultimately resulted in a closed company and zero working products. In 2015, full self-driving Teslas were supposedly just 3 years away. By 2017, those promised massive underground traffic tunnels turned into a small 2-kilometer loop in Vegas that actually still experiences traffic jams. And in 2019, those predictions of 1 million robotaxis hitting the road by the following year, well, they never materialized. The source uses this timeline to illustrate exactly how hype is continuously manufactured to keep these valuations artificially sky high. And this highly critical perspective is summed up pretty perfectly by investor Steve Eisman. You might know him for predicting the 2008 financial crisis. Speaking specifically on the SpaceX valuation, he said, "This is an IPO of a sci-fi story told for a sci-fi cult." It's a strong statement, and the source material emphasizes it to drive home the argument that investors are basically buying into a compelling narrative rather than solid financial fundamentals. All right, moving on to Section 4, the buy, borrow, die strategy.
So this source systematically walks us through this three-step financial loophole to explain exactly how the ultra-wealthy can fund these lavish lifestyles without having a ton of liquid cash, and more importantly, without triggering massive tax bills. Step 1 is simply buy. You keep your wealth tied up in company shares and you just never sell them because, well, taxes are only triggered when you sell, right? Step 2 is borrow. When you actually need cash, you just use those shares as collateral to take out massive, super low-interest bank loans. For example, the source specifically notes that back in 2022, Musk didn't sell shares to buy Twitter. He allegedly pledged roughly $62.5 billion in Tesla stock just to secure a $2.5 billion loan. And finally, step 3 is die. You pass all that wealth down to your heirs completely tax-free through various U.S. tax loopholes.
So the crucial point is the stark contrast in tax burdens that these strategies create. Look at this. Between 2014 and 2018, Musk's wealth allegedly grew by nearly $13.9 billion. Yet he reportedly paid only $455 million in taxes. That is an effective rate of just 3.2%. Meanwhile, the average working-class taxpayer, probably you listening to this right now, is handing over 20 to 30% of their income. The source draws a really sharp line here, arguing that this system is fundamentally tilted against the average citizen.
Which brings us to Section 5, the role of politics.
Here, the explainer shifts gears a bit into geopolitics. The source material outlines a timeline of alleged political favors, claiming that following a $90 million donation to Donald Trump's 2024 campaign and his subsequent election victory, Musk's net worth actually quintupled in just 2 years. The source points to several very specific regulatory changes. For instance, the NASDAQ altering its traditional rules to allow a fast entry 15-day period for the SpaceX IPO, and the SEC granting broker exemptions just days prior, which supposedly placed retail investor dollars at higher risk. On top of that, it cites drops lawsuits, FCC approvals granting control over 10,000 Starlink satellites, and even international policy shifts, like modifying national security rules specifically for Starlink's entry into India. We're just impartially relaying the source's assertions here, but they paint a picture of political connections allegedly protecting and inflating this wealth.
Finally, we reach Section 6, wealth and real-world impact. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the source steps back from the pure financial mechanics to look at the broader societal implications. It brings up a specific, massive challenge regarding the real-world's impact of hoarding this kind of capital. The United Nations World Food Program stated that just $6 billion could save 42 million people from extreme starvation. And when they were challenged to prove it, the UN actually provided a highly detailed roadmap for exactly how $6.6 billion would accomplish that goal. But, according to our source material, that comprehensive roadmap went completely unanswered, and the funds were never provided. To put that into perspective for a second, $6 billion is just a tiny, tiny fraction of a single trillion.
So that brings us to our final, really provocative thought from the source. As we look at these absolutely staggering numbers and the intricate financial systems that allow them to exist, we're left with a pretty profound question. How will history remember this wealth? The explainer concludes by reminding us that history rarely remembers people solely for their bank balances. It remembers them for what they chose to do, and just as importantly, what they chose not to do with the immense power and capital they accumulated. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I hope it gave you a clearer, more structured understanding of the forces at play behind this historic milestone.